Merry Christmas. My name is Benjamin. I'm of the seed of Abraham, and I live in Bethlehem. Bethlehem is a city that's about 5 miles from Jerusalem. It's also the place where David was raised. And he was a keeper of sheep of his father Jesse. And he kept those sheep on the outside of Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem has been changing through the years, and the population began to go down after David had been king. And we were down about 150 population. And there wasn't much going on. Not many things was happening along the way at all. And it was just sort of a simple life that was taking place in Bethlehem. Well, I need to stop telling you about my city or town. I could do that and go on for some time, but I'm here tonight to share my story with you. You see, some people say I'm an innkeeper. Now, I never thought about being an innkeeper. That's just not anything that I thought would fit me. We just had a big house. The missus and I was rattling around in it. The kids were all grown. My grandfather, Joshua Ben Yodel, had built the house back when his trading ventures were making money, and he had 14 kids. Now, a man with 14 kids, he builds quite a house. And so this was a big 4-room house that would take care of all 14 kids, and they would all have sleeping quarters within those rooms. And so after he was gone, the missus and I, we got the house, and we were living in it. We raised our children there, and all of a sudden they're gone, and we're looking at each other like, what are we going to do with this big house? So she said, why don't we take in some traveling people? Every now and then when somebody comes through and needs a place to stay, there's nowhere to stay in Bethlehem. And so when someone comes by and needs a place to stay, we can rent them a room, and we'll make a little money, and it'll also help take care of the house, and it'll help add a little bit of company to the house, and we won't be quite as lonely. So that's what we did. Well, everything's going fine until the governor, the king, the ruler, whatever we wanted to call him in those days, we called him a little of everything, but he decided to count all the people. He called it a census. But let me tell you something. It wasn't anything but just plain old taxation. That's all. Just a way to make money. And everybody had to go back to their hometown. They had to travel to wherever they lived. They had to travel back, and they had to register. And so therefore people were coming back to Bethlehem. And they were coming by families, and they were coming in great numbers. And it was hard to find somewhere to stay. We knocked on our door, and we said, sure, we thought this is going to be good. And so we took in a family, and we took in another family. And after a while, we had 3 and 4 families, and we said, well, the rooms, we got to do something. People still needing somewhere to stay. And so we talked to the people and said, we're going to have to crowd you up a little bit. So after a while, we had 3 and 4 families in the rooms, and people kept coming. And nighttime was coming, and it was sleeting, and it was cold, and my wife said, we've got to do something. So we slept in the big room, and we started putting people in the big room. And after a while, we had people all over the floor in the room where we sleep, and we had people all over the floor in the rest of the house. And people were still knocking on the door. I went to bed that night, and as soon as I was in the bed, there's a knock on the door, and I go, and someone said, we need a place to stay. I turned family after family after family away. I would say, we have no room. There's nowhere that you can stay. And they would look so sad. And they would look out at the weather, and they would say, it's a sleeting all over the area, and it's cold. And they would go out somewhere, and they would get in the shadow of a house, and they would roll up in their blankets, and they would try to find some warm, dry place that they could spend the night. And that kept going, and I felt so bad, but there was nothing I could do. But now I want you to know that I really think that I got a bum rap, because people said that I am some kind of heathen kind of person because I didn't allow Joseph and Mary a place at the inn when they came. And just simply said there's no room. And so I don't know who told them that I was an unbeliever, or who told them that I was anti Jesus or anti-religious, but some way the word got out that I'm just a bad person. But I want to set the record straight. I think it's time to set it straight. There was nowhere for me to put them. The knock came on the door. It was late into the night. And I went to the door, and here's this big burly feller standing there. Well, his hands, one hand was as big as both of mine, strong-looking fella. And he stood at the door and said, I need somewhere for me and my little Mary. And I looked at his little Mary, and let me tell you something, she wasn't little Mary. That's about the most pregnant you can get, now I'm telling you. And I realized they need somewhere, and I thought, what can I do? I don't have anywhere. And I said, there's no room. He wouldn't take no for an answer. He kept saying, but I just need somewhere, at least for my little Mary. And so I kept trying to say to him, there's nowhere. Everything's full. They're all over the floor. There's nowhere to put anybody. And he said, but there's got to be somewhere for me, little Mary. And I looked into his eyes, and I thought, I've got to do something. And I realized that even though the barn was full, the animals had been placed there, that we might could put them outside. They would go through the weather okay. And so I said, I can put you in the barn. We can get you some fresh hay. And he said, that'll be great. So we went out to the stable, and we moved the animals out, and I got him some fresh hay over in a corner, a dry area. And I put the hay down for him, and he got his little Mary, as he called her, and he got her over into that corner. And then he looked up at me and said, do you know where we might find a midwife? Because we might need one tomorrow or the next day. Well, let me tell you something. I knew immediately he didn't know a whole lot about the situation he was in. This lady was not going to be tomorrow or the next day. This lady was getting ready to give birth. I was watching her, and she would reach down and hold her tummy, and you'd see the labor pains going through her body. And I knew something's going to happen quickly. And I left the barn, and I ran down the street, and through the sleet and the cold, and I got to Aunt Sarah's house. And I knocked on the door, and her husband came to the door, and I said, I need Aunt Sarah. One of the guests is having a baby, and I think it's coming right away. I'll wait for her so I can walk back with her, but tell her to hurry. In just a little bit, Aunt Sarah came. She had her swaddling clothes that she kept with her, and she, just for a time like this, because you would wrap babies in swaddling clothes, and she had the rags that she had torn, and she had them in a bundle, and she got them, and back down the street we went. And when we got there, Joseph had Mary wrapped up in a blanket, and he was talking softly to her. And he was whispering things to her and trying to help her to feel a little better. And Aunt Sarah looked at me and said, you go get Rachel. That's my wife. Now, my wife had been a great help in a lot of ways. She made the best, by the way, she makes the best lamb stew anybody in the country. That's the reason people kept coming back all the time to the inn, is that she made great lamb stew. And they'd come back and say, can we get a bowl of that lamb stew? They didn't really care whether they spent the night or not, but they just wanted their lamb stew. I wasn't aware that maybe she could do some other things, but Aunt Sarah knew she could. And so Aunt Sarah said, go get your Rachel. So I go back in the house. I step over all of these bodies, carefully trying to keep from waking anybody up. And I wake Rachel up, and I get Rachel, and I said, Aunt Sarah needs your help. And so she goes out to the barn, and Aunt Sarah looked at me and Joseph and said, this is no place for men. You don't belong here. Get out of here. We went out, stood in the shadow of the barn, and we waited. It seemed like forever. And all of a sudden there was a cry. And I heard Aunt Sarah say, ooh, a beautiful baby boy. And they come out and got us. I wish you could have seen that big old burly guy, Joseph. Oh, tears ran down his cheek, and he just beamed, and he leaned over and he kissed Mary and said, it's a beautiful baby, hon. And they placed that baby into his arms. And he stood and held him for a moment, leaned over and kissed Mary, and placed that baby back with her. My wife finished up what she had to do, and Aunt Sarah finished up what she had to do. My wife went back to the house to go to bed. I walked Aunt Sarah back to her house, and the sleet had stopped, but there was still coolness in the air. And I left Aunt Sarah, and I said, boy, I'm ready to go home and go to bed. And so I tiptoed across to everybody. I was turning the lamp down, and I'm trying to keep from waking the people up. And I'm stepping over them, and just as I get ready to get under those warm covers, I hear this weird sound, murmuring and talk. And I thought, what is that? This hour of the night. And so I peep out, and I can hear it. It's out in the barn area. It's out where Joseph and Mary was. I made my way back across. I got my lantern. I made my way back out to where they were. And as I looked through a little bit of the crack around the door, I looked in. You know what was in there? Ragged, stinking shepherds. They're on their knees, right down on the barn floor. And there they are, right on that barn floor, knelt. And I thought, I am going to throw them out. These people need their privacy. And just as I started in to throw them out, Joseph held up his hand. And he said, they have come to worship the Christ baby. The Christ baby? The Messiah? In my barn? On my hay? My Aunt Sarah and my little Rachel has helped deliver the Messiah. Well, the first thing you know, I'm right beside of those stinking shepherds kneeling right there with them in the barn. And the old shepherd was telling the story of what had happened. He told about lights, angels, and what all they had said. And unto you a Savior is born. And they went through all of this. And they shared. And I thought, the Messiah? The Christ child? And all of a sudden, you could just feel it. You could just feel it. There was something different. And I began to worship. And if you'd have been there, you'd have been on your knees too. You'd have felt the same thing. And the report of the shepherd, oh, what a story it was. In a little while, they left. I stood there for a moment thinking, this is right here. Boy, nothing like this has ever happened in Bethlehem before. But this is the thing that's been prophesied. This is what we've been waiting on. And it happened here in Bethlehem? In my barn? On my hay? The Messiah. I made my way back into the house, stepped across all of those bodies, got back into my bed, and as I pulled the cover up over me into that warm bed that night, I realized things would never be the same again. You knew they wouldn't. And I was a believer. I was a believer. You couldn't help but believe. Had you have been there, and had you have heard the story of the shepherds. Many years later, this same man, grown, came back to Bethlehem. And when he came back, he talked about the kingdom of God. And he talked about how that kingdom was not an earthly kingdom. And I remembered, this man is the Messiah. And my faith was strengthened. And when he left there, I felt the same way I did when he left that stall, because I was a believer. I was a believer. And had you been there, you would have been a believer too.